And I would like to introduce Sophia Butt, and she'll be talking to us about dangerous times, the implication of counter-terrorism policies in educational institutions. And just a quick word on Sophia and her background. She's connected with the University of Birmingham. Come in. She's connected to the University of Birmingham, where she is involved in distance MA in Translation Studies, but also as an interdisciplinary doctoral research worker in linguistics, social policy, and law. I'm not sure whether that's at Birmingham or not. I'm sure
it is, yes.
Okay, thank you. And she's also, lucky woman, connected to Aalto University in Finland and Trinity College London, and also at Almaty Suleiman Demirel University in Kazakhstan. So I will leave it there, and Sophia can introduce you into her very complex and no doubt challenging topic. Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you very much, Anjali. Good afternoon, everybody, both virtually and physically in the room. Thank you for choosing to attend this session. As you can see, the title of my presentation is Dangerous Times, the Implementation of Counter-Terrorism Policies in Educational Institutions. And I've kind of been inspired by the 10th WILCO meeting, the title of that session. I'll take you through very quickly, give you an overview of what you can expect over the next 20 minutes or so. So I'll start off by looking at some of the key concerns that were raised in the 10th meeting of the WILCO group, part of which allude to the importance of language centres and government policy documentation. I'll then go on and present a very brief critical discourse analysis of counter-terrorism strategy wording. And the key question behind it will be, to what extent does this create social cohesion? And the relevance and the significance of social cohesion will be highlighted shortly. And then it'll be my concluding comments. So as Anjali said, I'm based at the University of Birmingham in the UK as a doctoral researcher and also a distance tutor. And most of my work and my interest in this field came about from my experiences in higher education. So I've been working in higher education for 23 years. And I now work internationally. Well, it's been 12 years or something. I've been working internationally. So it's this direction that education and language centres are taking, where with the changing political climate that we face. And so in its report dated January 2018, the WILCO group said that to mark the 10th meeting, the title was "The Language Teaching in Higher Education in Dangerous Times, the Role of the Network." And one of the things that this did was to reflect the concerns of language professionals about certain ongoing political developments across Europe and beyond. And one of the key points it made on page 2 is that language centres do not exist in isolation from the rest of the higher education institution, and the latter in turn cannot isolate themselves from political developments, whether on a national or international level. Now, this is quite interesting because when we look at this in relation to the key points that were mentioned at this meeting, it was said that language centres operate locally, nationally, internationally to address linguistic and intercultural divisions, specifically to help with social cohesion, to bring about social cohesion, to foster intercultural exchanges between home and visiting students and staff on campus, to acknowledge the benefits of multilingual and multicultural identities. So looking at the fact that it's not about a melting pot and assimilation, but mutual coexistence is important and should be respected. And through that, it's to look at how we can promote communication both within and beyond borders, and involving learners. Now, this is an important point here, to involve the key stakeholders. So it's not about talking at them, it's not about doing things to them, but with. So involving learners in topics to heal rifts in society and to foster intercultural sensitivity. So this is not about tolerance, but acceptance and respect. And so therefore it's linked to inclusivity. Now, this links it's quite interesting how it links to the words of Sigmund Freud, who said that words have a magical power. They can either bring together the greatest happiness or deepest despair, and that words enable the orator to sway his audience and dictate its decisions. So in other words, looking at words, whether it's in a classroom setting or in parliament, we can and do influence the minds and the thoughts and the decisions that are taken by people. So one of the questions that I'd like you to sort of keep at the back of your mind is, can language centers transcend classrooms where we can offer our expertise to our governments in the formulation of sensitive expressions in policy documentation? So if we bear in mind that most governments in most countries claim that they're interested in inclusivity, social cohesion, but the policy documentation or the policy itself doesn't necessarily do that. If we look at, for instance, the wording in the strategy of the Czech Republic document in the fight against terrorism, dated 2013, Section 4, which is about the prevention of radicalization and recruitment to terrorist structures, has a very important part, which says education needs to be at the heart of the effort to achieve a conflict-free coexistence. That's intercultural communication, understanding of the differences of other cultures, and acceptance of the fact that the culture of each of the communities enriches the Czech society as a whole. So this is presenting in the Czech Republic strategy, Section 4 and beyond, presents this idea of coexistence in a positive way and stresses the importance of education in this. So this point sort of, it made me think of a tale of two seas, So the Czech Republic is very similar, in fact, to Canada in this regard. Now, a couple of years ago, I did some research through the Universitas 21. They funded my research at McGill University in Montreal in Canada. And they have a very similar strategy, counter-terrorism strategy, to the UK. It's even called the same thing, the key part, prevent. It's even called the same thing. However, they have a similar approach to the Czech Republic, where the notion is one of coexistence, mutual respect, whereas in the UK, it's actually quite a different story. So what I'd like to do is to look at the wording of the policies, for example, in the UK, and ask you to think about, well, at the same time, there is this codependent claim about social cohesion and unity. For instance, so just a very brief background, the UK's counter-terrorism strategy is called Contest. It has 4 parts. The largest part by far is Prevent, which is also the most controversial section. There have been 4 iterations of the strategy. We're now on number 4, which was last published in 2018. So in the Prevent Duty Guidance, paragraph 114 states, we introduced the Prevent statutory duty through the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015. The duty requires local authorities, schools, colleges, higher education institutions, health bodies, prisons, probation, and the police to consider the need to safeguard people from being drawn into terrorism. What this means is we all have a devolved responsibility and a legal obligation to, quote, show due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. This means anybody in a public-facing role, whether it's in a swimming center, in a leisure center, whether it's a library, whether it's a school, a shop, anybody that's public-facing who sees signs, quote unquote, of somebody who may be displaying signs of radicalization or extremism or fundamentalism or something like this, needs to report this to the authorities. And this also includes educational institutions. So if we look at it from a critical discourse analysis perspective, the UK strategy, I'd like to just give you examples relating to 4 key areas. That's ideological squaring, presupposition, over-lexicalization, and suppression or lexical absence. And again, the question that's at the back of our minds should be, don't these linguistic devices conflict with the notion of social cohesion, contrary to what is claimed. So ideological squaring, for instance, is where the social actors are framed as being diametrically opposed. So it's basically like us and them, the notion of us and them, and the sociocognitive discourse associated with that. Oftentimes it's considered manipulative, primarily because anything that's negative that's associated with the self tends to be suppressed, and anything positive is enhanced, and vice versa for the them, as it were, the other side. So it's rarely highlighted if there are any positives for them. In the forward part of the contest strategy in the UK, it says, whether inspired by Islamist extremism, the far right, or the situation in Northern Ireland, the overarching goal of individual terrorists and the groups that support them is the same: to inflict harm, to inspire fear, and in doing so to look to undermine the very fabric of our society. Now, if we look at this from the perspective of ideological squaring, what you can see here is that this us and them is created in a way where it's our society, the green, us, our society, versus Islamist extremism, the far right, Northern Ireland activists, individual terrorists, support groups that support them, all of whom want to inflict harm, inspire fear, and undermine the fabric of our society, which must be opposite to all of these things. Now, the question is, this grouping together of these different subgroups within society has with it some kind of presupposition. Before I go on to that, here's another example in the section that begins prevent. So paragraph 105 of the strategy, it's presenting ourselves, we. So there's repetition of we as the government, presenting itself in a positive form. We ensure that we properly monitor, we evaluate, we make informed decisions, we look at the future developments, engage with academics, leading experts in the UK and overseas. We ensure we use the best available evidence, we evaluate projects, we engage with academics, we improve our understanding of how terrorists use the internet to radicalize and vulnerable individuals so that we can effectively disrupt terrorist activities. So everything pertaining to the self in the documentation that is also given to educational institutions to use as a guiding tool is presented in a positive light, and the terrorists, of course, and the groups are presented in a negative form. But this, of course, is all based on the notion of presupposition, which is a sociocognitive approach looking to decipher meaning in a way which Norman Fairclough termed as pre-constructed elements, and how language reconstitutes the social world. In other words, the presupposition is based on implied assumptions, shared beliefs, some mutual knowledge, and things that are considered to be givens. And through the presupposition, the writer or the speaker can foreground certain comments and ideologies which are socially or cognitively challenging to refute. The primary reason being because they're asserted or framed within presupposition triggers. So anybody listening to or reading it, it'll be difficult to challenge this. For instance, in part 1 entitled The Strategic Context, paragraph 34, the document states, this section sets out the global threat from terrorism, including its ideologies and methodologies, and highlights the activities of the two largest Islamist terrorist groups, Daesh and Al-Qaeda. It illustrates the impact of this global threat to the UK. Paragraph 37, it says, Islamist terrorism accounts for the largest proportion of terrorist attacks globally, with most carried out by Daesh, etc. Now, the presupposition part in here is that there is a global threat from terrorism. Now, if we think about the 250 plus countries in the world, is there genuinely a global threat, or is it a certain number of countries or a certain group of countries that are predominantly exposed to this threat? The ideologies and methodologies is that there is this presupposition that there is an us and them, or something where we are ideologically opposed to these extremists. Do we know that the two largest Islamist terrorist groups are genuinely Daesh and Al-Qaeda? Where is the evidence for this? And where is the evidence to suggest that the Islamists are the Islamist terrorists, and of course this is a contentious term in itself, a collocation in itself, are responsible for the largest proportion of terrorist attacks globally. So what we don't have here is the definition of terrorism in any of these documents. So again, there is this, this new notion of the communities, local risks, civil societies, and so on, and how the other side, we've got terrorist narratives, terrorists online, terrorist narratives again. So what we see here is typically there is a degree of over-lexicalization. So using many words for the same concept, there's a surfeit of repetition, there are quasi-synonymous terms, and essentially it's done to present an ideological problem, yes, but also to express and induce anxiety, to over-persuade the reader or the listener, and to frame a discourse of opposition in a particular way. Often it's also to defend one's own position. So again, look at this text here, and the over-lexicalization here, pertaining to the self, which is in green. The document refers to safeguarding and supporting rehabilitation, safeguarding people, enhanced responses, continuing effective support, and contrasting that with them, which is vulnerable people becoming terrorists, supporting terrorism, causes of radicalization, and so on. So there is a lot of repetition of safeguarding and supporting, and then terrorism and radicalization on the other side. What you also notice, or what we also notice, is that there is some suppression and lexical absence. So this is the opposite of over-lexicalization. And importantly, the absence of expected items which are designed to cause deliberate ambiguity. So this results in meaning modification due to incomplete facts, like Grice's maxims of quality, quantity, relevance, and so on, and how those are often flouted to manipulate meaning. Because what this does is alters the role of the social actors or the agents in the narrative. So take a look at this, for example. Daesh exploited political fragility and civil war to control large swathes of territory in Syria and Iraq, proclaiming a so-called caliphate in 2014, brutally oppressing the local population and exacerbating a major humanitarian crisis. If we look at that, it's true. Who would deny that? But in terms of lexical absence and suppression, what we don't have is the effects of and the roles enacted by the other social actors, for instance, the invading forces, how they took control, immediate and continued control of the lucrative oil fields, targeted destruction of infrastructure, exploited, pillaged, and turned a blind eye to looting by locals. There was pre-planned investment by the Halliburton Group, for instance, in the US, linked to Bush and his family, and the collateral damage and the numbers displaced in the major humanitarian crisis. So all of these things, too, have obviously exploited political fragility to control large swathes of territory, brutally expressing the locals, and so on. So what we have then is essentially what Edward Bernays, who is the nephew of Sigmund Freud, he used psychoanalytical strategies to assist democracies to engineer public opinion and manufacture consent. He said, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. The voice of the people expresses the mind of the people, and the mind is made up for it by the group leaders in whom they believe. It is composed of inherited prejudice.
I have about 30 seconds left, Sophia.
Cliches and verbal formulas supplied to them by their leaders. So the point again here is, on the one hand, we have claims about how we're trying to aim for inclusion, mutual coexistence, but documentation and the guidance that we take from that perhaps tells a different story.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophia. Can I open this to questions? We have one person online, I think, and a few people in the audience. Please, over to you. You may have to speak loudly.
Yes, I can't hear anybody at the moment.
Okay, let me see what this question is here, the online question from somebody called Hassan Shiko. What would you suggest for the government to use instead of we in paragraph 1052? If it uses the government instead of we, then wouldn't it be interpreted as we who govern you? Was that question clear?
Yes, yes, it is. Yes, thank you very much to Mr. Shiko for that. Thank you for the question. Yes, that's a very good point. I think yes, there is that element of if we have government, then it's associated with the notion of governing. However, there's also some kind of a separation between possibly bodies. You know, so this thing that you have like an institution, or if we were to use something like, if we're referring to educational establishments, let's say, for instance, and we have one educational establishment that's putting forward ideas of, you know, this is how we do it at Imperial College London, or this is how we do it at Harvard University, or this is how we approach it at Masaryk. There's a different kind of a tone, or something that's being put forward in terms of interpolation to some extent, positioning oneself as being superior or inferior to the other, and that's part of the issue in terms of what's put forward through the documentation. These 20 minutes have kind of whizzed by, and it's very there's a lot of research that I've done on this, and with specific examples of the impact that it's having here in the UK, and the negative impact, unfortunately, in terms of the contradictions between what is put forward by the policymakers in terms of how education should be used in educational institutions and language centers and higher education institutions, and how actually it's very controlled, and the slightest thing, it's manipulative in terms of how it impacts learners and staff.
Thank you. Any other questions here? I have one, and I wonder whether you could go back to one of your very early slides. I think it might even be the first one, where you first laid out the us and them thing with the different colors. Where was that?
This one?
Possibly, just a second. Yeah, I think so. Oh no, the one where you list all the different kinds of places that have to be involved in. Yes.
Where I list what, sorry? All the
different, you said schools, educational institutions.
Ah, yes, yep.
Various...
that is...
It's a long list of things.
Yes.
You highlighted higher educational institutions, something like this.
This one.
Yes, okay. So, my question is this. If I look at 114, I hope everyone can hear me. If I look at 114, it says a whole list of various places where people interact with people, and where certain kinds of, basically the people that this study or presentation on the part of the government is aimed at: local authorities, schools, colleges, etc., health bodies, prisons, a whole string of things there, right? And what just makes me wonder is one of those, let me count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different kinds of places. They're very different, and one of them is highlighted, which is higher education institutions. Okay. I'm looking for the lessons that a language center will take from this careful study. And it looks like there's a jump from a certain level of generality to, and this is an interesting discussion, but I'm also chairing a session on language policy in a language center, and I'm looking for how to make that link. Can you help me?
Well, this is one of the major contentions on controversies that surround this policy, that this prevent duty guidance that is given to all of these institutions and these different parts of within the public sector. They have the same duty guidance, the same vague guidance, basically telling anybody who works in these fields that they need to keep an eye out for people who may be displaying behavior that is considered indicative of some kind of either being exposed to radicalization or being someone who's radicalizing others. So there's actually there isn't, this is the whole problem. There isn't actually any specific guidance that's given to, whether it's to prisons, whether prison services, whether it's to higher education institutions. I can give you an example. There was a study that was done a number of years ago, 2010, I think it was, 2010, by two psychologists here in the UK who focused on the prison service. So they went...
Hang on. Sorry, Sophia. Can you bring it with your interaction and knowledge of language teaching and language centers? Could you bring it to us in a language center who want to know what can we take from this?
But this is the example. I was just about to give an example about this. There was a study. That's okay. There was a study that was done by two psychologists who focused on people who are in prison who had been convicted of either crimes related to extremism. The government then used the study and the results of that study to create a questionnaire which they gave to primary school children. So the results of the study from the prison, based on the prison, incarcerated adults, was used for primary school children to create a questionnaire to give to them in class to try to see how these children would react to these different ideas and notions. And they were very simple questions, but they're completely unrelated to to what we need to be looking at, or whether the primary school kids, how they can behave. But in terms of, I think if we look at this this particular document, the strategy of the Czech Republic in the fight against terrorism, when you read on in other sections of this, and for example compare it also with the Canadian strategy on counterterrorism, they refer to the need to have genuine discussions in class, in educational establishments, and the same could apply in terms of language centers too. For example, encouraging people to give presentations on a topic that may be a hot topic of this nature. So not shying away from discussions related to these topics, not stigmatizing certain groups. So there are preconceived notions about, and that's where the part about the ideological squaring comes in. But to actually have real conversations. For instance, in the UK, this is what's claimed, that in school, in language centers, in universities, there should be these discussions. And yet when these discussions take place, those people, if they belong to a particular ethnic minority or religious background, they are automatically reported to the government as showing signs of radicalization. So a kid, for example, an 8-year-old child who was given a project at school on terrorism, went to a library, took out a book on terrorism, and was reported and was questioned for 3 hours. Why did you take out this book? So there's a claim that it's about openness, it's about discussion, it's about honesty, it's about mutual respect, and it's about putting the learners, at the center of it. But in reality, it's doing something very different. So,
Okay, thank you. I have a follow-up question, but I'm going to give one of the online people a chance with their question before I come back to the audience here, because this question's been waiting. And it's Hassan again in response to your earlier response. And he says, in this context of interpretation, how would you deal with the accusation of being, in inverted commas, a conspiracy theorist? I'm not
That's a good
commenting
question.
on Hassan's question. I'm just reading it exactly as it is.
Okay, that's a very good point. Yes, this idea of interpolation, this theory, it's Louis Althusser who presented this theory about interpolation that's related to the idea of.
I'm sorry. He said interpretation, not interpolation. Might be my mistake. Interpretation, not interpolation.
Okay, I wonder if that might be an autocorrect or something, you know, but because I was mentioning but this idea, yes, there is this it's one of the ways of shutting people up, isn't it? To it's convenient if people don't think along in the same lines as you, if they are challenging, if they are presenting some kind of ideas that challenge our own areas, or it could be, for example, take us out of our comfort zone, or it's very convenient to label somebody a conspiracy theorist to try to belittle and demean an idea. It's a way, it's like the loudest voices get heard, you know. So somebody who may be putting forward, you know, there are so many ideas and in over history where after 50 years, when something's been, you know, classified files have been released, it's, you know, half a century later, it's like, oh yes, well, it's true that such and such a thing did happen, or so and so was assassinated by the government, or this, you know, and these things happen 50 years later, where the so-called conspiracy theorists are probably not even around anymore, and half the people couldn't care less. So it's I think it's a strategy, it's a way of trying to belittle, demean, silence any kind of dissent, so-called dissent, or potential mutiny.
Okay, thank you. I hope you heard all that, Hassan. Anybody here for the next question? Yes, Joe.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, Sophia, I really find it really compelling and fascinating the way you're able to connect sort of bad writing, essentially, or, you know, I'm using that term really loosely, but sort of the kinds of writing that we probably as language teachers would need to focus on and talk about with our students, with connecting that with these large ideological issues. I think that's really compelling and important. And I especially relate to, because I teach academic writing to social science students, many of whom are, you know, going to be the writers of these types of documents, let's say, or at least the advisors to the people who are writing these type of documents. So I guess really my question is just, I wanted to say, like, I think I have already been teaching lessons on conciseness and reducing this, what you're calling
Over-lexicalization, yeah.
But I'd like to maybe incorporate more of the 3 or 4 other sort of problem areas that you mentioned, and I wondered if you have like lessons on this stuff, whether you teach ways of avoiding these problems in writing, and I know that's, I mean, whether you do or not, but I guess my question is whether I guess I'm thinking especially about the ideological squaring, whether you have an idea of how to teach that.
And you know, one of the ways. Thank you very much, Joe, for your question. That's really it's useful, because yes, I do teach like yourself, I do teach academic writing, also critical thinking, and even something, let's say, for instance, like literature review writing, where we expect our students to process so much literature and then critically engage with it, you know, and inevitably we bring our interpretation to anything that we read, and irrespective of how objective we try to be. But in terms of trying to get the students to minimize the over-lexicalization, say, for instance, it's about minimizing the repetition, avoiding tautology. And so I would give them texts and ask them to identify the repetition is easy enough to identify, of course, isn't it? Because they can see the words being repeated. But the tautology depends on the students. You know, some of them don't realize, oh, I've just said the same thing in a different way. Or in some cases, perhaps that's exactly what the writer is trying to do, or the speaker is trying to do, you know, to try and reinforce a point by saying it differently. But often in the case of writers who are new, or perhaps they when I say new, I mean sort of in terms of higher level, advanced level. Yes, I will give them texts, ask them to critique the text, to identify, you know, give them very sort of pointers. So, for example, it could be in terms of identify the collocation that's used here, identify where there are examples of an us and them strand that's kind of laced into this writing, you know, in this way. So usually it would be to give them complete texts, preferably starting with shorter texts and then longer texts, and then asking them to identify, give them, you know, like, I don't know, a list of 10 things or something, and say, can you identify examples of these in the writing? And then how would you rewrite it? How would you rewrite each of those?
Sorry, Sophia.
Thank you very much, Sophia.
We are running out of time here.
Okay.
And you have been very kind to deal with the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you also for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you to thank you, Anjali, and to everybody who took part, and both online and also here in person. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.